Greetings and welcome back to room 303 and AP English and our World of Ideas lectures. This is lecture number 19, the Allegory of the Cave, of course derived from the great Plato and especially Republic Book 7. We are in Unit 4 and the topic for Jacobus is mind, and we'll be working with the Jowett translator in our close reading now of specifically Book 7 of the Cave Allegory. Now, we always talk about assumptions at the beginning of these lectures, and this is a huge one. My assumption is that you have already watched my introductory lectures on Republic. If you have not done that, then I very much recommend that you stop right now, go to learnstrong.net, go to the AP folder, the World of Ideas folder, and find our earlier lectures to make sure you're up to speed. In that introductory lecture, I talk about Republic, the place of Republic within the greater world of Plato's dialogues, and I talk about briefly Republic books 1 through 6, and then book 7, and then book 8, and 9, and 10 to follow. And in doing that, you get a good understanding of the background information. Here, we're going to concentrate now specifically on Plato and the rhetoric of the actual cave allegory of book 7. It will help you immensely if you already know what that is about. So that's our first assumption. The other assumption is that at learnstrong.net, in the World of Ideas folders, that you've already looked at lectures and studied with us lectures 1 through 18, because I'm going to be calling on a lot of that information as well. We also assume a familiarity with our learning theory, that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways, and at the end of our conversation, we'll be playing the game. Of course, annotation is the way we do this. That is to say, active reading. At level 1, we ask, what does this text say? And here we work with our paragraph outlining. So for every paragraph, we're just going to try and summarize in our own words what is being said. At level 2, we answer the question, what does all this mean? How can I make meaning of any of this? At 2a, themes, messages, but we also concern ourselves, and this is hypercritical for our study of Plato, because in many ways Plato kind of invented the big five, as we call it. That is to say, what does this text suggest about epistemology and what we can know? What does this text say about ontology and who we are? What does this text say about psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, the study of the group of minds? And finally, what does this text say, maybe most importantly, about theodicy, the fact that there is pain or suffering in the world, and what is the value of fear and pain? We'll, of course, have much to say about that, as we already have, if, of course, you followed my lectures on the cave allegory already. And then at 2b, we'll ask not what Plato says, but how Plato says it. We'll concentrate on especially his use of allegory and, of course, the Socratic method of dialogue and the famous questions, right? And then at level 3, we'll ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way, at 3a, to other titles that I know of that we've studied in AP, and then finally, of course, and I think always, most importantly, how can I relate to this information personally? There are people who, of course, marginalize Plato as an old-fashioned thinker. I think, of course, that there's something to be said for that, but I think as well there's something to be said for old-fashioned ideas. Old-fashioned become new-fashioned. That is to say, in 303, we've often said that the new, N-E-W, is the new, K-N-E-W, and no question in Plato, we find that we're rediscovering, wow, you know, this cat's pretty old, but he had a lot to say about some modern, postmodern, and even, dare we say it, post-postmodern ideas. I'm hoping that we will get there. And then, of course, my final assumption is that, and I mean this, I really hope that you read this material on your own and then come to me to help you read this material in the Jowett translator, and maybe go and find other translators as well of this material. Let's do some real quick brief biography of Plato. Now notice we say Plato, not Socrates. We spent a lot of time talking about Socrates in our earlier lectures. Now we're going to concentrate on Plato himself. The dates 428 to 347 BCE. We believe that he came from an aristocratic family, probably Athenian family. He was a student of Socrates, and that changed his life forever. Of course, the $3.99 hemlock shake that his teacher Socrates had to drink. Forever that changed his trajectory, and it appears that what happened then is that he decided he would go ahead and spend the rest of his life what we would call today as a writer and a philosopher and a professor of some kind, inventing, of course, some argue, the university as we come to understand it, the academy. These dialogues that he wrote, of course, where Socrates is the primary interlocutor. That term we've used before, to locute, means to speak. An interlocutor means somebody who speaks. Socrates, not all the dialogues, but often is the prime speaker in the dialogues, right? Of course, we will pay attention now to what Jacobus has to say about Plato's philosophy. Now, some have made the distinction between Platonic thought and Socratic thought. And we have said, of course, in our lectures that we're only working at the epidermal level in these lectures, okay? So, of course, you can find far more depth beneath them. And then you can make distinctions between Socratic philosophy and Platonic philosophy. But for our purposes now, let's just talk Platonic philosophy. I'm going to work with you on page 275, 276 of Jacobus real quickly, because I think he says a fine job to condense a whole lot of Platonic philosophy. He says it this way: although it's not easy, and this is one of those "it gets dark at night" obvious observations. Although it's not easy to condense Plato's views, he may be said to have held the world of sense perception to be inferior to the world of ideal entities that exist only in a pure spiritual realm. Go back to our earlier lectures, Platonic theory of the forms. That is to say, the second box is more real than the first box. And again, if what I just said makes no sense to you, then I very much recommend that you go back and take a look at our earlier lectures at learnstrong.net in the World of Ideas AP World of Ideas folder. These ideals, or forms, of course we're familiar now, Plato argued, are perceived directly by everyone before birth and then dimly remembered here on earth. But the memory, dim as it is, enables people to understand what the senses perceive, despite the fact that the senses are unreliable and their perceptions imperfect. In other words, we're born with all of the things we need to know in our souls, but then at birth we forget them in some way, and then the experiences that we have somehow bring about a remembering of a kind. Now, psychologists today, and I think here of Jordan Peterson, who has argued there's some interesting truth in what maybe Plato was onto here. You know, when you stumble onto an idea that you feel like, some of you have said this about some of the comments that we've made over the time in 303, that when I make comments, some of you go, well, you know, that's funny you would say it that way, because that's something I guess I've always known, maybe not so capable of putting into words, but certainly something I feel like the minute I hear it, I know that it's 100% true for me and maybe for others as well. This is the Platonic notion of learning theory. This view of reality, to continue now with Jacobus, this view of reality has long been important to philosophers because it gives a philosophic basis to anti-materialistic thought. It values the spirit first and frees people from the tyranny of sensory perception and sensory reward. In the case of love, Plato held that eros leads individuals to revere the body and its pleasures, but the thrust of his teaching is that the body is a metaphor for spiritual delights. Plato maintains that the body is only a starting point which eventually can lead to both spiritual fulfillment and the appreciation of true beauty. Okay? Just to finish one paragraph later, Plato's Allegory has been persuasive for centuries and remains at the center of thought that attempts to counter the pleasures of the sensual life. Most religious aim for spiritual enlightenment and praise the qualities of the soul which lies beyond perception. Thus, it comes as no surprise that Christianity and other religions have developed systems of thought that bear a close resemblance to his. Later refinements of his thought, usually called Neoplatonism, have been influential even into modern times. And of course, as we have said in earlier lectures, St. Augustine is a prime example of this notion, as of course is Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. Those, of course, we can add as a list, a growing list at 3a of titles that we would, of course, associate with our study of Plato and the Republic. Let's now turn to Plato's Rhetoric, shall we? I'm with you on page 276. Jacobus will point out what we have said already in earlier lectures, but we'll now come back to. When you look at Plato's Rhetoric, there's two things of the cave allegory that stand out. The first is, of course, allegory, this notion of an important story. If we are the stories we tell, as we've said in 303, we retell the stories we accept, the stories maybe we reject. This happens often, right? Then allegory for us is a powerful tool in our study of Plato, especially in this reading. Some bizarre stories, we said in the earlier lecture, but there seems to be a whole lot that's referenced at multiple levels symbolically about this. The other is, of course, the other rhetorical technique we're emphasizing here is the dialogue form itself. Very important. An early kind of rendition of taking the epic tradition, Socrates, as we have said, Socrates as the new epic hero, the new Achilles, and joining it to the dramatic form as well. And when you put the two together, you come up with this thing called the dialogue, and it's quite brilliant. On page 277, just read with me. This question and answer technique basically constitutes the Socratic method. Socrates analyzes the answer to each question, obviously beginning by defining terms, examines its implications, and then asserts the truth. The method works partly because Plato believes that people do not learn things but remember them. Go back to the dialogue called the Meno, where Socrates is able to somehow be able to help someone who knows no mathematics recognize that in fact this individual knows quite a bit of mathematics even though he's uneducated in the like. That is, go back to Jacobus, that is, people originate from heaven where they knew the truth. They already possess knowledge and must recover it by means of the dialogue. Socrates' method is ideally suited for that purpose. Beyond these techniques, however, we have to look at Plato's style. It's true he's working with difficult ideas, but his style is so clear, simple, and direct that few people would have trouble understanding what he's saying at any given moment, considering the influence that this work had on the world, on world thought, and the reputations that Plato earned by the time he came to write the Republic. Its style is remarkably plain and accessible. Plato's respect for rhetoric and its proper uses is part of the reason he can express himself with such impressive clarity. And we would pause, as we have said, we're reading these essays in Jacobus and elsewhere so that we can improve as writers ourselves. And our compositional efforts, oh man, they're going to be so much better served, you guys, if we can be clear and concise. Okay, now we know the cave allegory in terms of earlier conversations. Let's now look at it from the rhetorical perspective. Let's work at level 1. Let's work through our paragraph outlinings. I'm going to start and I'm going to join these into groups. Paragraphs 1 through 14. We're asked to imagine prisoners living since childhood in an underground cave or a den, chained so they can't move or see anywhere but straight ahead. Behind them is a fire, cast shadows on the cave wall in front of the prisoners as people carry various objects past the fire, obviously causing shadows, yes? The prisoners, seeing nothing but shadows, assume the shadows are all there is to reality. Okay, first movement of the story, as we have already outlined in earlier lectures. Paragraphs 15 through 18. If a prisoner were released and turned toward the light, he would not immediately be able to see the objects whose shadows he formerly watched, nor would he believe that these objects are more real than the shadows that would cling to his old idea of reality. Makes sense. Paragraphs 19 through 26. If the prisoner were taken out of the cave, he would be still more blinded by the sun's light. Blinded by the light, of course, the famous line. At first, he would see shadows and reflections most easily, then objects, the heavens, and at last the sun, which he would reason about and deduce to be a sort of god of the visual world. Paragraphs 27 through 34. Remembering his whole life in the cave, this is the third movement, as we articulated it in the earlier lecture, third movement. Remembering his whole life in the cave, the prisoner would pity his companions and rejoice in his own good fortune. Their contest at shadow watching and prediction, with honor and glory attached to winning, now would seem not enviable but repellent. But if he were taken back to the cave and forced to rejoin the contests before his eyes got used to the dark, his fellow prisoners would pity his blindness and keep any others from leaving the cave. Or he might choose intentionally to go back, as we gave in our evidenced in our lecture. And of course, within Buddhism, we call this what? The Bodhisattva, don't we? The idea of returning back to help those who have not yet figured it out. Now, at paragraph 35, we begin to talk a little bit about what the allegory means. The cave, of course, is the world of sight. The firelight is the sun. The journey upward is the soul's ascent into the intellectual world. The sun is the idea of good, author of all things beautiful and right, the power on which men would act rationally must fix, right? Those who reach this upper world dislike returning to the cave, where they're forced to argue about justice with people who have never seen it. We think of Socrates, obviously. Paragraph 41 to 52. The eye can be blinded by either abrupt light or abrupt darkness, but sight cannot be put into blind eyes. Rather, the soul must turn from darkness to light to use its capacity for perception of the good. A clever rogue might have been a wise and good man if his soul had been cut off in youth from sensual pleasures that lowered its vision. Go back to our early lectures about the notion of education as a process of selection and deselection of important information to be shown to a child. To finish now with the dialogue, paragraph 53 through 62. In the ideal republic, neither the uneducated nor those who never end their education will make able ministers of state. The founders of the state will compel its best minds to attain the good and then to descend again back into the cave for the benefit of the state. The rulers of the state will be philosophers, capable, obviously, as we have said, of recognizing the forms, enlightened and uninterested in fighting for power. The state whose rulers are most reluctant to govern is governed best. Now, of course, that one sounds very much like Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, as we have said in an earlier lecture in the world of ideas. To finish now, paragraph 63 through 65. These philosopher rulers will take office as a stern necessity. The political arena must offer them better rewards than power and wealth, so that those rich in virtue and wisdom will be willing to hold office. Well, of course, we know this word picture very well from the earlier lectures. Let's now finish with our conversation regarding levels 2 and 3. Now that we've been through quite a few minutes of conversation, taking into consideration all of the prior lectures, and then finally this one as a summative lecture. The big five. What does this text say about epistemology and what one can know? Well, of course, we know through sense experience, but we recognize that sense experience can be, in fact, wrong. And to that degree, the epistemological certainty or absolutism, the shadows on the wall were absolutely real, have to be replaced not by relativism, because clearly the epistemological position does not work. To say all of life is meaningless makes the very statement that you just made meaningless. To say there are no absolutes is to posit an absolute, that there are no absolutes, the performative contradiction, as we've said. And to that degree, epistemologically speaking, and this is what Plato will call perspicacity, insight is the fallibilist position. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong, and that I could be wrong is, of course, the birth of the scientific method and the scientific enlightenment as well, isn't it? When science, of course, becomes absolutist, epistemologically, we call that scientism. And, of course, that's as dangerous as any other absolutist position, which often will lead epistemologically to kind of a shutdown or to blindness, right? What does this text say about ontology and who we are? Well, I just mentioned blindness. We are kind of blind, aren't we, to reality. That is to say, we know about that first box. We can see beautiful bodies, but we often have difficulty thinking about the concept of beauty itself. We can see the human body, but we have a difficult time with what it means when we talk about the human mind. Again, as we've said, if we cut off the top of your skull, we're not going to see your mind in your brain. Well, then you don't have a mind? No, I'm inclined to think I have a mind. Well, at least I did until I started reading these kinds of texts. But you know, the idea that, yeah, okay, my mind, but what is it and how does it work? See, that's all products of this. Ontologically speaking, that's what we are. We are not just body, but we are, of course, also mind. Or to go back to our earlier comments about that four-quadrant model of Ken Wilber, we're actually four things, aren't we? That upper right, we're a body. The upper left, we're a psyche, aren't we? But we're also lower left, we're some kind of cultural phenomenon, and lower right, we belong to a larger group of systems, don't we? All of those working together in some evolutionary understanding. We're always not just growing up, but waking up, aren't we? Ontologically, Plato is going to argue for it. Psychologically, what does this text say? Well, the power of fear and pain cannot be overlooked. We know they exist, and we know they exert powerful influences on us psychically, but that's not all bad. For Plato, fear and pain is the conduit whereby we become human. We learn through fear and pain. The propedeutic is the term we used in the prior lecture. What does the text say about sociology? Well, no question. Beautiful, beautiful allegory about the power of education, the power of the teacher to help the student, release the student through fear and pain, from beliefs that are in fact just opinions and they're not real. Of course, the returning to the cave is fundamental to our reading sociologically. I mentioned the Bodhisattva vow of Buddhism. This notion that once you understand something, it's a challenge to go back. Of course, what do we say about those who go back? Well, they're often obviously maligned, made fun of, shot, crucified, and the like, tragically. What does this text say about theodicy and the existence of pain and suffering? Two important ideas, fundamental to our time in 303. One, doesn't disagree that there is fear and pain in the world. People who try and argue that there is no such thing as fear and pain and suffering are, of course, trying to sell you something, right? That is to say, the film Princess Bride comes to mind. No, life is fear, life is pain, life is, as the Buddha said, suffering. And yet, part two, it can be useful. We have to learn how to ask when bad things happen, not why did this happen to me, where I'm a victim in this universe and terrible things happen, but rather, why did this happen for me? Foundational to Platonic teaching regarding theodicy. To finish, 2A messages, well, again, as we said, you're not a victim. Have some courage, stand up and live a powerfully positive life. Find your way out of the cave and then get back in the cave and go to work helping others. Another major message, of course, is to forgive others, because they're not yet, that's the key word for your notes, yet, they're not yet out of the cave. They haven't seen the light. And to that degree, well, the great teacher Christ said on the cross, forgive them, not because they're nasty sinner reprobates, forgive them for they know not what they do. They're ignorant. In other words, help them. Don't just revile them. A third and final message is obviously live your life with intentionality. Try and stay away from that notion